In this video, I'm going to talk about everything you need to know if you're considering buying a home in British Columbia. This is going to be a comprehensive guide whether you're buying a condo, townhome, or detached home. There will be a section specifically focused on what you need to be aware of if you are buying a strata property, which is a condo or townhome. So if that's not what you're looking for, feel free to skip it as soon as you get there. The markets that myself and my team focus on are Surrey, Langley, Vancouver, and the rest of the Lower Mainland. But if you are buying outside of this area, the majority of this information will still be extremely relevant. This video is going to be split up into 6 sections, which consist of agency, financing, wish list with strata properties included, home search, offer process, and accepted offer. First, let's talk about agency. Agency is a relationship between two parties in which one person, the agent, is granted the authority to represent and act for another person known as the principal in dealings with others. So in this instance, it would be the agent-client relationship you'd have with your realtor. Once an agency relationship is entered into, your agent is legally obligated to work in your best interests. Ideally, an agency relationship is created by a written contract where the authority of the agent is clearly laid out. However, in some instances, agency can also be created through the conduct of the real estate professional, even if neither of you have the intention of entering into an agency relationship. This is known as implied agency. Implied agency is established by the actions and conduct of the involved parties rather than by a clear agreement or contract between the two of you. This could occur when a real estate professional casually provides the type of guidance and advice that is meant to be reserved for clients, but you end up relying on. Under common law, your agent owes you a number of fiduciary obligations, including the following. Duty of loyalty. This means that they will act only in your best interests and always put your interests first, even before their own. Duty of full disclosure. This means they must tell you everything they know that might influence your decision in a transaction. Duty to avoid conflicts of interest. This means they must avoid any situation that would affect their duty to act in your best interests. And duty of confidentiality. This means they must not reveal your private information without your permission, even after your relationship ends. This includes your reason for buying or selling, your maximum or minimum budget, or any preferred terms and conditions that you may want to include in a contract. What you need to know is that real estate professionals have a regulatory requirement to present you with this consumer information before providing you any services. This is done by what is known as a disclosure of representation in trading services, or DORTS for short. And what you need to understand is that this is not a contract. This is just a disclosure form that must be presented and disclosed to you prior to you sharing any personal information with that realtor. So if this is presented to you, don't freak out. As I said, it's not a contract. You don't hold any sort of obligations to that realtor. It's just something that we're forced to do. And in all honesty, I'm not sure that the majority of realtors actually present this before having a conversation. However, they are legally obligated to. Something else to note is that there is no dual agency in BC, meaning that the same realtor cannot represent both you, the buyer, as well as the seller. This was banned a couple of years ago. I know it does still exist in some of the other provinces, but it's actually a good thing, in my opinion, that it's been banned here. However, there are some very limited exemptions, and as far as I'm aware, I've never actually seen them be carried out. I know in specific, extremely remote areas, there may be a case for it. However, I haven't heard of any that have actually been passed. Additionally, if there are two realtors from the same team, they can also not represent you, as this would also be considered dual agency. And honestly, this just makes sense, because how can your realtor both best represent you, the buyer, trying to get you the best price and conditions, and conversely, also best represent the seller who has the opposing goals in that transaction. You will also likely be asked to sign a document known as the privacy and consent form. Essentially, this explains that some of your personal information will go onto the MLS system and may be made public. Additionally, on this form, there are 4 boxes that you can initial if you want to consent or not consent to who is still allowed to contact you. One of those people being your realtor. And so far throughout my career, I haven't had anybody sign off on this section stating that they don't want to talk to me ever again after the transaction has commenced. And in all honesty, that would make the whole process pretty awkward if they were to sign off on this before we had even purchased them a home. And lastly, some realtors may ask you to sign a buyer's agency exclusive agreement. This contract outlines the relationship between you, the buyer, your realtor, and their brokerage. It also highlights the services the brokerage will provide. Essentially, it's It's an agreement that you will exclusively work with that realtor. On this contract, it will also clearly state a start and end date for that agency and the market area to which the contract applies. Please note you're not obligated to purchase a home at any point in time if you sign this contract, but essentially it's a commitment from both parties in order to state that you're going to work together. And while we're on this topic, let's now talk about how to pick an agent. So first of all, one of the most important things is definitely experience. Now, make sure you understand that experience doesn't necessarily just mean the number of years that somebody's been in the business, because somebody who's had their license for 10 years and sold 4 homes per year definitely doesn't have the same level of experience as somebody who's been in the business for 4 years and sold 30 homes per year, totaling over 100. If you are considering working with someone who is newer in the business, you want to make sure that they're working with a competent team or some sort of a mentor, because the last thing you want to do is have an inexperienced agent mess up the largest transaction of your life. So you're also going to want to determine what areas they service. For instance, personally, the areas that I focus on most are Surrey and Langley, as well as the rest of the Fraser Valley. However, I have a business partner who takes care of Vancouver and the rest of the cities across the bridge. Now, previously, I used to do business everywhere, but at the end of the day, it really just doesn't make sense. And that's why I formed this partnership in order to make sure I have a local market expert in the areas to best service my clients. It's also a good idea to question them on where they get their business from. The majority of the best realtors in the business have built a business around repeat and referral clients. And why is that, you might ask? Well, clearly they did a good job for those clients, and that's why they're using them again, as well as referring them to friends and family. Additionally, it's always a good idea to look up their reviews. This can be done on Facebook or Google or Rate My Agent or any of the other major sites. However, for the most part, I think it's pretty common that everybody has some sort of Google reviews. And if those agents happen to have testimonials as well, potentially even a video testimonial, that's even a bigger bonus. Next, you're going to want to know about their availability. So something I want to point out here is you need to ask them whether they're a full-time or part-time agent. The reason being is that if they have another job, how are they going to be able to adequately service you? It's tough enough to try and keep up with the market on a daily basis doing this full time, so I can't even imagine trying to do it on a part-time basis. Additionally, they'll just likely have far less experience. Now, this isn't always the case, but it's just something to keep in mind. And I hate to say it, but I do have to question why they are a part-time agent in the first place. Because if they were extremely good at their job, why don't they have the confidence or the results to be doing it full time? But that's just my take on it. Next, you're going to want to know what sort of advice and information you're going to be given. Are they sitting down with you, giving you a full buyer's presentation before taking out the properties? Or is the first time you're really chatting and meeting at the first property you see? I personally always get on a Zoom call with new clients and take as much time as needed. Generally, this is between 30 minutes to an hour and a half. And this all depends on how many questions they have and what their comfortability is with the buying process. And this is extremely important in busy markets, because if you're not prepared or educated, this is where the biggest mistakes can be made. So it's always best to front load the learning and education and pick up the other things as you go. Because when you find that ideal property and you're ready to put that offer in, you don't want to be scrambling last second trying to learn something that you could have learned a week ago. Next, you're going to want to find out if they are on a team or a solo agent. Now, there's definitely pros and cons to both, but here's a couple of things to think about. If you're working with someone who's on a team, typically there's going to be one individual who takes the lead. However, if they're not available, there's always going to be somebody else to cover for them. Conversely, if you're working with a solo agent, you're going to know exactly who it is that you're speaking with every single time. However, if they go out of town, on vacation, something happens to them, you might be left all on your own. Sometimes solo agents have colleagues that they've set up a relationship with that they will cover each other when they're gone, but this is definitely something you should clarify right from the start. And if you're working with a team, that's also a question you're going to want to ask up front, because if you're expecting to work with the team lead the entire time and you're just handed off to a buyer's agent, you need to know that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Typically, these buyer's agents specialize in the buying process in the specific area that you're looking, but you just want to make sure that you know that that is how the process will look. And lastly, but potentially one of the most important aspects, is do you like them? When you're purchasing a home, you're going to be spending a lot of time with this individual. And when you're not with them, you're going to be having a ton of conversations. So are they somebody that you can get along with? Do they get on your nerves? That is really for you to decide. However, the one warning I will give you is don't choose somebody just because you like them. You still want to make sure they're checking off all the other boxes that I already mentioned. And I actually have one last point, and that is, what is their industry reputation and what sort of relationships do they have? This is extremely important in busier markets, as the better the relationship and industry reputation that your realtor has, the better it's going to work for you. If you're in a multiple offer situation and your realtor knows the realtor on the other side and has worked with them before, that's going to give you a leg up. Now, this has nothing to do with them liking them more than someone else. It's knowing that the transaction is going to go smoothly. Because if your realtor doesn't have a good reputation and has burned bridges before, it's unlikely that other people are going to want to work with them, especially if they've already had a bad experience. And that brings us to part number 2, which is financing. So generally my advice is actually to go out and get a pre-approval at a bank or with a mortgage broker before you even start any of this process. However, I do find oftentimes that people will want to talk to the realtor first before they go out and do this, especially if they're not familiar with the process. But at the end of the day, you need to figure out what your budget is, because there's really no point in you going out and looking at homes if you can't actually afford them. And if you are interested in just going out and looking at beautiful homes, there's always open houses on the weekend. But if you're serious about buying a home, you need to get that pre-approval. And the way I like to explain it to people is you wouldn't go on a road trip before checking your gas, so you're not going to go home shopping before getting your pre-approval. Now, once you've gotten your pre-approval, there's a couple of other things you're going to have to consider. Just because you qualified for a certain amount of money, you need to figure out whether you're actually comfortable going that high. And this is what we're going to call your comfort level versus your actual maximum affordability. And this always varies person to person. Your lifestyle will definitely play a big role in this, as well as what it is that you do for work. Because if you're on a fixed income, you know exactly what's coming in every single month. Compared to if you're on commission, this could vary drastically. And at the end of the day, if you can't even sleep at night because you're so stressed, it's really not worth it. And this kind of just comes down to your risk tolerance. But that is definitely a conversation you'll want to have with your mortgage professional. So where should you get your mortgage? And this is the age-old debate of should you go to a bank or should you go to a mortgage broker? There are pros and cons to each. However, I'm going to give you my opinion. And that is that you should more than likely go to a mortgage broker. And here's why. When you go to a bank, all they have is their own product. Versus when you go to a mortgage broker, they're going to have options for several different lenders and can match make you with the best option. The way I best like to explain this is you wouldn't walk into a Honda dealership and they would tell you, hey, you know what? These Hondas aren't for you. You should go across the street and buy a Tesla. I think you can agree that's not going to happen. They're going to try and put you into whatever car is in their shop that is best going to suit you, even if there's a better car out there for you. And most of the time, the mortgage broker actually has access to the bank you were looking to go to anyways. And when we talk about rates, they're going to be very comparable, but your broker can often even get you a better rate than your bank. And sometimes this can be due to the amount of volume that they do. So if you're working with a broker who does a high amount of volume, a lot of mortgages, they can sometimes be getting volume discounts. But at the end of the day, this is a decision that you're going to have to make for yourself. And one last point to add to that conversation is that when you go to the bank, a lot of the time, if you're not working with a mortgage professional, this is somebody who's doing several other things. That might be helping people with budgeting, saving, investing, or anything else. And this means that mortgages aren't their specialization. In comparison to a mortgage broker or a mortgage professional that works at a bank, mortgages are all they do. They know them inside out. To add to that, the person at the bank is likely getting paid whether they actually help you get a mortgage or not. Whereas a mortgage broker only gets paid if they actually help you fund a mortgage. And guess what? There's no cost to working with a broker unless you're getting something like private financing, but let's not even go into that today. If you're going the standard route, you have good credit, everything else looks good, you're not going to have to pay any additional fees. Now, what about a fixed versus a variable rate? Once again, this is going to come down to your level of comfort and risk tolerance. Historically, if you go with a variable rate mortgage, it's always been shown to do better over the long run. However, if you were like me and got a variable rate mortgage 2 years ago, you're actually in a losing position, at least in terms of monthly payments. So what you need to keep in mind here is that a fixed rate mortgage is going to maintain the same level of payment for the entire entirety of your term, whereas a variable rate mortgage will change as the overnight lending rate changes. However, there are two types of variable mortgages. There is a floating and a static payment. So essentially what this means is with a floating variable rate mortgage, as the overnight lending rate changes, your payments will change as well. So throughout the term of your loan, the amount of principal that you're paying down will not change. However, the amount of interest will go up or down based on what interest rates do. Conversely, with a static variable rate mortgage, when interest rates change, your payment doesn't change. It's only the level of interest and principal that you're paying down. So as rates go up, you end up paying a higher percentage of interest and a lower percentage of principal. And when rates go down, it does the opposite. Now this is true, but only to a point, because if rates go up too high, your payment may have to change if you're only paying interest at a certain point in time. So if you're living on a fixed income and you don't have any sort of reserves, obviously it probably makes more sense to go fixed, especially if you're already on a tight budget. However, if you're comfortable with making your mortgage payments and you're okay with a little bit of flexibility in payments, then variable might be a better option for you. But once again, please consult with your mortgage broker. Next, let's talk about mortgage insurance. So mortgage insurance is required on any mortgage where you put down less than 20%. When you do this, you're going to be charged a premium on top of that mortgage amount. And in general, this is somewhere between 2.8 to 4%. And this number is going to depend on how big your down payment is. So for instance, if you had a 5% down payment, then you're going to have a 4% premium. Whereas if you had a 15% down payment, then you're only going to have a 2.8% premium. Now this number will be lumped into your mortgage and it's going to be a one-time fee. Now something interesting to note here is that you're actually able to get a better rate for your mortgage if you have mortgage insurance. Now this might seem strange because if you put down 20%, it might seem like it's safer for the bank. However, because they purchased this mortgage insurance through one of the three insurers, they've essentially protected themselves, and that's why they can give you a bit of a discount. And next, let's talk about your deposit. This is a sum of money that's going to be due at the time that you commit to purchasing a home. It's generally going to be around 5%. However, there is no specific number that it has to be. But in BC and specifically the Lower Mainland, this is what we typically do. So this is going to be due at the time of subject removal or within 24 hours, depending on what your contract says. And don't worry, we're going to get to what subject removal is in a little bit. So typically it's able to be paid by way of bank draft or EFT. And if you're wondering why it can't be done with just a normal check, well, anybody can write a check even if you have $0 in your bank account. Whereas with a bank draft, essentially what happens is the bank is going to guarantee that that money will stay in your bank, but you're not able to touch it. And by doing so, it basically gives the seller a guarantee that the money is actually there. Now, the next component of your financing is the down payment. So it's important to note that your deposit and your down payment are similar yet different things. Your deposit will actually form part of your down payment, but your down payment isn't actually due until you go to the lawyer's office for completion. And it's at this time that all of the funds are transferred to the seller. So what is the minimum down payment? Well, it actually depends on the purchase price. So if your purchase price is $500,000 or less, then the minimum down payment is 5%. Now, if the purchase price is between $500,000 and under $1 million, then it's going to be 5% on the first $500,000 and 10% on the portion between $500,000 and $1 million. So for instance, on a $700,000 purchase, the minimum required down payment would be $45,000. And lastly, on a purchase that is $1 million or more, it's going to be a minimum of 20%. However, when you get to the higher price points, sometimes lenders can require even more. But again, please have that conversation with your mortgage broker. So on that note, an insured mortgage is anything that's less than 20% down, which means essentially anywhere between 5%, which is the bare minimum, and 19.99%. And then what we refer to as conventional financing would be 20% or more. So there's no maximum down payment. You could technically buy that property outright in cash, but I just wanted to cover some of the minimums based on your purchase price. Also, I want to cover a common misconception, which is if the purchase is not your first time buying that you're not able to put less than 20% down. And this just isn't true. What it actually comes down to is if the property is going to be your primary residence and what the total purchase price is. So if you're purchasing a rental property, it's going to be a 20% minimum no matter what. But if it is your primary residence and it's under $1 million, then you're going to be able to put down between 5 and 10% depending on what that price is. Moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is your closing costs. So these are essentially all the other costs on top of your mortgage and your down payment. So typically the biggest one you're going to have to worry about is your property transfer tax. And so once again, this is calculated based on your purchase price. So it's 1% on the first 200,000, 2% on the portion between 200,000 and 2 million. And if you're over 2 million, then it is 3% on that portion. So a quick calculation, if you're under the $2 million price point, is taking 2% of the total purchase price and then subtracting $2,000. For instance, on a $1 million purchase, it would be 20,000 minus 2,000, which would be $18,000. Now there's actually some exemptions that you need to be made aware of. So if you're a first-time home buyer and your purchase price is under $500,000, then you're exempt from paying property transfer tax. And if your purchase price is between $500,000 and $525,000, you'll get a partial exemption. Additionally, if you're purchasing a pre-sale or new build and the purchase price is under $750,000, you're also going to get an exemption. And if it's under $800,000, once again, it's going to be a partial exemption. But the good part about new construction is that you don't have to be a first-time home buyer in order to get this exemption. One thing to note here though is that it does need to be used as your primary residence. And this is true for both situations. Next, you're going to have to hire a lawyer or notary to take care of the conveyancing. And in general, this cost is going to be around $1,500. Now, I always advise my clients to hire a lawyer, even if it is slightly more expensive. And to be honest, typically it's about the same price. Now, the reason being is that if for some reason, God forbid, something goes south during the transaction, a lawyer can actually represent you, whereas a notary cannot. Now, luckily, throughout my career, I've never had this happen to any of my clients. However, I have heard some very rare horror stories from others, and it's just not worth it. But at the end of the day, it's up to you. Now, while you're going through the purchase process, you're likely going to want to get a home inspection. So typically this is going to run you between $300 to $1,000 depending on the type and size of the property. Obviously, a small condo being on the lower end and a massive home on an acreage being on the higher end. But this is a decent ballpark to account for. Next is going to be the cost of an appraisal. Typically, and don't quote me here, the mortgage broker or lender will end up paying for the appraisal, but sometimes you may be required to pay. And in general, this cost can be between $300 to $500. So once again, just make sure you've taken into account just in case. Moving on to our next cost, that's gonna be your movers. So movers can get extremely expensive. Again, depending on where you're moving from and where you're going to, as well as how much stuff you have. Many people opt for just renting a U-Haul truck and getting some friends to help them out, and this can definitely save you some costs. But just keep in mind, it's also probably going to be a major headache. I absolutely hate moving, but it just depends if you want to spend the money or not. The next cost is going to be your adjustments. So essentially on all properties, this is going to be your portion of the property taxes for the year. And if it's a strata property, your portion of the strata fees for that month. So these numbers can vary drastically depending on if you're moving at the beginning or end of the year. So just take a look at what those numbers are to give yourself an idea of what it's going to cost for the given property. But luckily for you, your lawyer is actually going to do all of these calculations on what is called the statement of adjustments when you go to visit them. And they will provide you with a copy prior to coming in. And moving on to our last cost, it is GST. Now GST is actually only applicable on pre-sales or new construction, as well as substantially renovated homes, which is essentially 90% or more of the home. So if you're buying a resale property, you don't have to worry about this. But if it is a new build or pre-construction home, then you're going to have to tack on 5% to that purchase price. And that can be a substantial amount. So just keep it in mind. And moving on to part number 3, it's creating a wish list. So what you're going to want to do is come up with your wants and your needs. Now we will differentiate these in a minute, but here are some of the things you need to think about. What is the type of property? Is it a condo, townhome, or detached home? What is your budget? What is your preferred location or locations? How many beds and how many baths? Are you going to need a den or a flex space as an office or something of that nature? What size of a home are you going to need? So if you know the rough square footage of what you're looking for, this is extremely helpful. If it's a detached home, how big of a lot are you looking for? How many parking spots? Do you have any pets? And if so, what type are they? How many? And what is their height and weight? Now, this is going to be important in strata properties, as there are bylaws in many which restrict both the number of pets, if you can even have pets at all, and either the size or weight. Now, if you're purchasing a detached home, are you going to want a basement suite, or potentially even two, or maybe a coach house? This could be important if you're using the funds from that suite in order to help with your mortgage. How many people total are going to be living in the home? This can be important in strata properties, as there is often a maximum number of people, which is dictated by the number of bedrooms. Do you have a preferred direction that the home is facing? If it's a townhome or detached home, do you need a yard? Is a view important to you? And what are the dates that you're looking for to move in and take possession of this home? So this is going to depend on if you're on a strict timeline or if you're a little bit more flexible. And then any additional notes that we didn't cover about what is important to you. So these could be things such as the walkability of the area. What is the school catchment? Are there parks nearby? Is there shopping nearby? And what about transit, if that's important to you? So at this point in time, we're then going to break down what are your must-haves and what are your deal breakers. And then everything that falls in between are going to be things that you can live without, but you would like to have them. Because at the end of the day, I can always find you what you're looking for. However, most of the time, if you're trying to find that 10 out of 10 property, it's typically going to be above the budget that you're looking to spend, or it's going to be in a location that isn't your ideal location. So generally, you're going to have to make a few minor sacrifices. And that's why we really need to figure out from the start what those are. So a couple of things that I like to point out before we actually go out and look at homes is to think about the things that you can change versus the things that you can't. For instance, things that you can't change are the location, the floor plan, and the building itself if it's a strata property. However, things that you can change is the paint, the floors, appliances, and lights. Now, there may be a little bit of flexibility in terms of moving around closets or lights or changing bathrooms. However, this is going to depend on the structure of the home. If it's a strata property, what are the bylaws and other things of this nature. But the key point here being focus on the primary things that you really can't change. Because unless you're living in a mobile home, you're not going to be able to pick up that home and move it to a new location. But if you can get over the puke green walls that have been turning every other person off as you go into a home, and you remove your emotions from the situation and realize this might actually help you get a deal and you can paint over it later, this is where I see a lot of my clients having success, because they're able to overlook these minor things that other people can't. Something else I want to go over prior to the actual home search is looking at owned versus rented property. So what I mean by this is, was the home owner occupied, or did they previously have a tenant living there? Because in general, and please take this with a grain of salt, but I've seen a lot of properties, owners take better care of their properties than their tenants. And that's not to say that tenants are bad, but there's a little something called pride of ownership. And if I was to take a large sample size of each, I can almost guarantee you the owner-occupied properties would probably be in better shape, at least most of the time. However, this does present an opportunity, and there's a few reasons for this. Number one being, if the tenants are still living in the property while the sellers are showing it, generally it makes the property a little bit more difficult to show, and it typically doesn't show as well. And for this reason, it's typically going to attract less buyers, less people are going to be interested in the property, and there's potentially more room to negotiate. An additional point is, if you're looking into a strata property, you're going to want to try and figure out what percentage of the units in that complex are rented out. Generally, you can find this on the Form B, however, it's not always available, but it's something you should look for and keep in mind. One of the reasons for this is that if the majority of units are rented out, a lot of the times owners will push off things that they would likely not push off if they were living there. And what I mean by this is, let's say hypothetically, the roof is pretty much at the end of its life, and there's a vote at the strata meetings for if they should replace it. Now, a lot of the time, this isn't going to be fully covered by the contingency reserve fund, and owners will likely have to cough up some change. And in properties where there's a heavy investor focus, a lot of the times they will try to push this off for as long as possible. And if you're an owner in that property, this generally isn't a great thing for you, because the longer things are pushed off, it actually ends up probably costing them more money in the long run. So just something to be mindful of. Now, the last component of this wish list is going to be figuring out whether you're looking into resale or pre-sale properties, which are also often referred to as pre-construction. So essentially you're looking at a brand new property versus a used property, for lack of a better term. And so I just want to quickly go through the pros and cons of each. Now, without actually diving into the details, obviously the new property probably sounds a little bit more attractive, but here's a couple of things that you're going to need to keep in mind and see if you're okay with. First of all, you're likely just going to be buying it based off of a floor plan in a showroom. Generally, developers and their sales teams will have 1 or 2 showrooms, but they may have 10, 15, or even 20 different floor plans. So yes, you get an idea of the finishing and appliances and other things of that nature, but if you're not purchasing an identical unit, then you're not actually going to be able to get a feel for that floor plan. And sometimes there isn't even a showroom. So if you're someone who wants to actually physically be in the space before you buy it, then it's something you're going to need to consider. Next, you're going to be paying a premium. Of course, brand new versus used. I think this part of it's pretty straightforward. The next point is that you're going to have the ability for more personalization. Generally, when you're buying pre-construction, you're able to choose one of 2 color schemes. Now, on top of this, you can add some additional things such as choosing the flooring. Are you going to have carpets in the bedrooms? Maybe you can upgrade appliances, or even potentially slightly alter the unit that you're purchasing. And of course, with a resale property, you can always go back in there and make changes. However, doing it from the start is obviously a lot more ideal. However, one of the major cons is that there's pretty much next to no negotiation, especially in a hot market. Now, when things slow down, sometimes you'll be able to negotiate for things such as decorating allowances, maybe an additional parking spot, some free upgrades, but it's not very often that you can actually get a major discount on the price. Some of the other things that maybe you can potentially negotiate on are the assignment fees as well as the deposit structure. But I wouldn't be walking into a busy pre-sale center and trying to negotiate $50,000 or $100,000 off a property like you might in the resale market. And then lastly, you have the 2510 warranty, and I'm going to cover this in a little bit more detail in just a minute here. Now, moving on to resale property, you get to actually view the physical unit. You get to see it in person, you get to touch it, you get to feel it, you know exactly what you're getting. Which, just to add to this point, when you're purchasing a pre-sale unit, the developers have some sort of a variance, generally within 5% of the square footage that they promise, that they can vary. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but if you're paying $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 per square foot and you're shorted 25 square feet, well, that adds up pretty quickly. Another pro of resale is that there's generally more negotiation, as already mentioned. However, these properties are typically less modern unless they've been substantially renovated. And on this note, a resale property may potentially also need updating depending on its state and your taste. Now, going back to pre-sales, I'm looking at some of their benefits. The first one is that they're flexible. And what I mean by this is typically it's a 2 to 4 year completion time frame. Now, this is going to depend on if it's a townhome or condo and if it's wood frame or concrete, because a wood frame townhome is going to be the quickest completion and a concrete high-rise is going to be the longest completion. And even though you're provided an estimated completion date, there is generally some flexibility here. I would say on average, it's usually done slightly afterwards. Another pro to purchasing pre-sale properties is you have more leverage. Now, what I mean by this is twofold. Number one is that the deposit structure is typically going to be staggered. So this may be 5% up front, another 5% in 90 days, and then a final 5% in 6 months or a year. There are also pre-sales where you may only need 5% or 10% down. It really varies from project to project. And on top of this, you don't need to qualify for a mortgage until the property is actually complete. So the major potential bonus here is that you're hoping that that money is going to grow through appreciation over this period of time, where conversely in a resale property, even though your property is increasing in value, if the market's going up, you're still having to pay down your mortgage, and a portion of that is going towards interest. So a lot of people, and especially investors, do like this aspect of pre-sales. And just to give you an example, let's say you purchased a $500,000 pre-sale condo and you put down a 5% deposit. So you're only into this project for $25,000. Now, let's say between the time that you purchased and it completes, it goes up by $50,000, even though the project itself has only increased in value by by 10%, your return on investment is actually 200%. Now, keep in mind that's prior to any sort of taxes or fees that may be associated with selling it. But there are other ways to get the equity out of that property, which we'll save for another video. Another major pro is the fact that it's hassle-free. So you really don't need to do anything while it's being constructed. And this goes for whether you're purchasing it for yourself or if you're an investor. Whereas in comparison, if it was a resale property and maybe you're doing renovations, then obviously it's going to take some time, effort, and additional money. And just to name a few more benefits, if you are planning to rent it out, or maybe even in the future, tenants obviously desire newer properties. And because of this, you're typically going to be able to charge a higher rent versus an older property. Now, back to a couple of the cons and or risks of pre-sale properties. The first being that there's often time delays. So as I mentioned, even though there's an estimated completion date, there's no certainty there. It could be earlier or it even could be later. Next is the fact that there's GST on top of the purchase price. So as I mentioned earlier, on pre-sale properties, you're gonna have to pay 5% GST on top of that purchase price. So on a $500,000 condo, that's gonna be an additional $25,000. Next is gonna be a lack of quality assurance. So there's ways to go about trying to mitigate these risks. However, they're always inherently gonna be there. Generally, the showroom is going to be the nicest and most well put together, but there's really no guarantees that when you get your actual unit that it's going to be to the same standard. Now, you do get a final walkthrough where you get the developer to come back and fix any deficiencies. However, it's not always as clear cut as it may seem, and sometimes it can be difficult to get them to come back and actually complete it to the standard that you're hoping for. Generally, they do a pretty good job, especially if you're using a trusted and well-known developer, but I've also heard some horror stories. So just keep it in mind. And lastly, in the absolute worst case situation, the project may not complete whatsoever. Now, if the developer isn't able to reach their target level of funding and they can't get the loan from the bank, then the project isn't able to continue. Now, this situation actually happened to my parents years ago when they bought a project out in Penticton. They had bought in an early phase, and unfortunately the developer wasn't able to sell off some of the remaining units. And because of this, they had their money tied up for over 2 years. And yes, at the end of the day, you do get your deposit back. However, essentially they lost money because of inflation and because of opportunity costs. And what I mean by that is that money could have been elsewhere in another project in the stock market, whatever that may be, making them money. Now, on a similar note, let's compare older versus newer properties. So older properties, as already mentioned, may need more updates. However, a lot of the times they are larger and more functional, especially if we're talking about condos. But that can also come at a price because of the fact they will likely also have higher strata fees, which is due to a combination of two things. Number one being the size of the unit, as strata fees are based on unit entitlement, which essentially means that larger units pay more and smaller units pay less. And the second thing being that the older these strata properties get, the more expenses come up, such as roofs, doors, balconies, siding, and more. And since the Strata Corporation has to plan on how to pay for them, most of the time they're going to increase the strata fees in order to plan for the future events. Conversely, with a newer property, yes, it's going to be more modern, you're going to have to do less renovations, but in general, they're going to be smaller. It feels like every single year, a 2-bedroom condo just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Previously, you'd see most of them being in the 950 to 1,000 square foot range. Now it feels like more often than not, they're in the 750 to 800 square foot range. And the reason for this is the more units that a developer can fit into a building, the more money they're gonna make. And as a business, their goal is to make the most profit possible. Now, the benefit here is that the newer properties are gonna have lower strata fees, both because they're newer and typically because they're a little bit smaller. And then additionally, whether it's a pre-sale property or it's just in its first few years of life, that property is gonna have its 2-5-10 warranty. So what exactly is this? So you have 2 years of warranty on any defects to labors and materials. And of course, there are some limits that do apply, but I'm not going to get into too much detail here. You then have 5 years of warranty on the building envelope, and this includes water penetration. And then lastly, you have 10 years of warranty on the actual structure of the building. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is the part where we specifically dive into strata properties. I know there's been some intermingled throughout, but this is where we actually dive into it. So if you are specifically looking looking at a condo or townhome, one of the things you're going to want to consider, of course, is the strata fees. So as I mentioned before, this is based on unit entitlement, essentially the size of the unit. Now, when you're taking a look into the strata fees, you're going to want to find out what's included. In general, this is maintenance and upkeep, landscaping, snow removal, amenities, if there's concierge, a pool, and anything else of the sort. So generally, all this is included except for water and electricity. However, sometimes these are also covered. And you're just going to have to read through these strata documents in order to determine this. So something to keep in mind here is that low strata fees isn't always better, and high strata fees aren't always bad. There are other factors that you need to take into account. For instance, if you have higher strata fees, but they're planning for an upcoming project, personally, I would rather pay an extra $50 or $100 a month than get hit with a massive special levy for $5,000 or $10,000 in a couple of years from now. And that could potentially be the case for you if the strata has chosen to keep fees low for an extended period of time, even though there's big work on the horizon. Next, you're going to want to take a look into the bylaws and the rules. So the biggest one here being, are there any age restrictions? Now, with the recent changes to age restrictions here in BC, the only one that still remains is 55 plus. But of course, that's an important one if you're a young family. So you're going to want to make sure that the age restrictions aren't going to limit you. And for those of you who have pets or are planning to get pets, make sure you find out what the restrictions around those pets are. And there's a couple of other things you're going to want to look into. For instance, if you really want to have a barbecue and that's a deal breaker for you, sometimes they don't allow these. So you're just going to have to read through the bylaws and rules in order to figure this out. On top of that, sometimes there's restrictions on what you're allowed to have in your outdoor space or even what you're allowed for flooring. So whether this is a deal breaker for you or not, it's always good to know. Now, when we're looking at strata properties and trying to figure out pricing, one thing I'm often asked is, should we be using price per square foot? And my answer, well, it depends, but yes and no. So generally, when we're looking at pre-construction, I like to use it more here, but with resale properties, I don't think it holds quite as much value. Additionally, there's a couple of other things you need to consider. So is the space in the home actually used well? Essentially, what is the usable square footage? If there's a bunch of square footage that's wasted in hallways, then that's obviously something that you want to know. Additionally, if you are comparing multiple units with a price per square foot, you need to take into account whether the other units have parking or lockers, and this will be part of your calculation. I think regardless, you can use a price per square foot comparison. However, you should also use other metrics, but I'm not going to get into too much details on those in this video. The best way to go about this is use direct comparisons. Obviously, the actual building you're in is going to be the best, but if you can't do that, look for other buildings of similar age and quality. Something to keep in mind here is that the smaller the units get, the higher the price per square foot goes. And conversely, the larger the units, the lower the price per square foot goes. So for instance, a 1-bedroom unit is going to have the highest price per square foot, whereas a 2 or 3-bedroom unit, that price per square foot is going to come down. So don't be comparing 1-bed units versus 2-bed units. Now, when you're buying strata properties and specifically condos, there's so many cookie cutter floor plans out there. So something to think about is what is going to get you the highest ROI when you sell it in the future. And this is something I like to refer to as having the wow factor. What makes that property stand out amongst the other ones? Because if there's 50, 600 square foot 1-bed condos on the market, especially if you're in a slower market, what's going to actually make it sell? So essentially look for units with great floor plans, something unique, maybe a loft style unit, or having beds separated on each side, or maybe just having an amazing outdoor space. Because in a hall market, everything's going to sell. But if you're selling in a down market, what's going to make you stand out amongst the competition? And in general, if you're selling a condo, trying to get up into a townhome, or potentially even a detached property, the best time to try to upsize is in a slower market. And that's why it's just that much more important. Next is looking into the building amenities. So there's some pros and cons to this. When you first walk into a building and it has a pool, a concierge, a hot tub, a gym, that may really stand out to you and it may look very attractive. But you have to ask yourself, how often will you actually use them? How much is it impacting your strata fees? And what is that going to look like down the road in terms of cost? Because more amenities means higher strata fees and higher future expenses. You have to remember that you're probably going to spend 80 to 90% of your time in the unit itself. So you want to focus on the actual property first and amenities second. Because most of the time, the amenities really aren't that great anyways. There's definitely a few complexes that stand out and I think would be worth it, but for the most part, they're pretty small and dinky gyms, and the pools aren't that great either. And realistically, you could probably just go down the road to a Club 16 and pay $20 a month for a gym. But I do understand the convenience, so take this with a grain of salt. Another thing to think about when purchasing a strata property is who was the developer. Are they established? What's their reputation? You're going to want to both ask your agent as well as do your own research. Generally, you're going to want to go with a bigger name over a smaller name if possible. And this becomes ever more important if it's actually in the pre-sale stage, because a developer that's established and has deeper pockets is going to be able to withstand a down market, or as a newer one that maybe doesn't have as much capital might not make it through. Moving on to part number 4, this is when we actually start your home search. So probably 95% of the time, this is going to start online. So after you've had a meeting with your agent and gone over your wants and needs, they will start to send you properties. And of course, you can also search for properties yourself. Everybody has a different level of comfort here, but they're definitely the expert, and this is what they do on a daily basis. However, if you're somebody that works on a computer or from home or is on your phone a lot, I know a lot of clients that I have are constantly refreshing realtor.ca. So it's always great to have a combination of both. It just depends on your preferences and how busy you are. From here, you're going to want to start to save a list of your favorite properties and send them over to your agent. And once you've started to compile a list of these properties, you can then start to go out for private tours, showings, and open houses. Generally, we like to schedule a tour of 3 to 5 properties if possible, just to make the most of our time. And because it gives you a better comparison when you're looking at one property after another after another. So your agent should be attending these showings with you as much as possible. The only real times when they may not be able to attend is if you're going in that window when open houses typically happen, and for some reason they're tied up and you weren't able to go at another time. Generally, you can work around this, but as you can see, this could potentially be a conflict if you're working with a solo agent that has several clients. So just keep this in mind and figure out what your level of comfort is and what level of service you're expecting. And essentially what I was just getting at is the fact that most open houses are between the times of 12 and 4 p.m. on the weekend. And the most popular time slot is definitely 2 to 4. And because they have this specific window on the weekends, sometimes the seller or the listing agent isn't as flexible with showing it before or after that time on the weekends. But it really varies property to property. In regards to booking private showings and tours, your agent is going to go about doing this for you. And so you definitely want to let them know what your availability is and give them a few different times that you can go out and see them, because you're going to have to coordinate their schedule, your schedule, the seller's schedule, and sometimes the listing agent's schedule as well. And what I mean by this is sometimes properties are on lock boxes and sometimes the agent shows them, but we'll get to that in a minute. One thing I do want to note here is that while you're sending your agent properties, sometimes properties will appear to still be active, whereas they may have an accepted offer or they might actually be sold. So we don't really have any sort of a pending status if there's an accepted offer. The only way to figure this out is for your agent to go on the back end, where there is a section called Realtor Remarks, where sometimes the other agent will leave a comment here. And if they haven't, then they'll just have to reach out and find out directly. But unfortunately, this information isn't available to the public. It's just something I want you to be aware of, so it doesn't seem like your agent's trying not to allow you to go to a specific property. It could actually be sold. And we as agents generally don't have the power to change the status. We have to send all the documents into the real estate board, and sometimes they can get slightly delayed. So it may not show up for a couple of days. Additionally, properties that do have an accepted offer sometimes will still show because of the fact that they haven't yet removed subjects and the deal isn't firm. And this really just depends on how the seller and listing realtor want to deal with it. So it's generally not a bad idea to go out and view a property with an accepted offer, because if they don't remove subjects, then you're able to act right away. Sometimes what I like to do in these situations is keep in contact with the listing realtor and find out how the subject removal is going. And as it gets closer and closer to subject removal date, if it's starting to look shaky, then maybe you can go in. But if things are looking smooth, then maybe you just don't want to waste your time. Now, when you actually physically go out to view the properties, there are 3 different situations. Either A, the property is on lockbox. So what I mean by this is the property will have one of these on it, and only a licensed realtor can actually access it. Well, hypothetically, they're the only ones that are supposed to be, and if your realtor gives you a code to get into one, they could lose their license. So I would advise you stay away from anyone who's trying to do that. Option number 2 is that the listing agent will be at the property and let you in. They might then show you around the property, or they could potentially just stand outside. It really just depends. What I found here in the lower mainland is that typically the Fraser Valley Real Estate Board that I'm a part of, so essentially anything that is east of the Fraser River, generally works more on lockbox. However, the closer you get to Vancouver, the more often the listing agent is actually there to show the property. Now, this is an ongoing debate of what's better, and there's definitely pros and cons to each, but I'm not even going to get into that today. And then situation number 3 is that either the sellers are home or tenants are home and they're going to let you in. Obviously, this is typically the least comfortable situation, as you'd like to view the home on your own. But generally, when this happens, I warn my clients ahead of time. And one final thing to note here is that when you're in someone's property, always assume you're on camera and microphone. There are several owners who will have cameras inside of their properties for either safety reasons or to try and get an edge on what you're saying about their property. So even if there's not, it's always best to just act like there is, because you don't want to give sellers any sort of advantage, or conversely, piss them off by saying something negative about their property. Keep the conversation inside the property factual and have your deeper conversations once you're gone. Something else you're going to want to pay attention to when you first enter a property is your gut feeling. Now, you definitely need to find a balance between your logic and your emotion, but how you feel about that property in the first 30 seconds that you enter it tells you a lot. Personally, I'm a lot more of a logical person, so I have to find the balance on the emotional side, but in general, most people make their decisions based on emotion. Just make sure that it's actually a gut feeling and not something minor that's throwing you off. Additionally, you want to pay attention to the things that your agent's saying to you when you're in the property. If you feel like they're trying to sell you on it, that might be a red flag. You want to make sure that they're transparent and honest with you. There are neighborhoods and complexes that I will tell my clients right up front, I don't think it's a good idea. Now, I will never tell them what to do or not to do, but I will voice my opinion. And this is extremely important because you're in an emotionally vulnerable state when you're looking at homes most of the time, especially when it's for yourself. And that's one of the biggest roles we play as agents, is to remove the emotions and take an objective view. Because when things get overly emotional, you need that level-headed person there to help guide you. Now, the next component is how I get my clients to rank properties. And I think you'll find this very helpful. So we use a scale from 1 to 10. If they rank it between a 1 and a 6, this is a write-off. We don't even think about it. We just move on. If it's a 7, 8, or 9, this is kind of the sweet spot and something we're definitely going to strongly consider. I tend to push people away from using the number 7 just because it's very easy to give that number as an average property, but it's definitely not a complete write-off. And generally, when we're in this 7 to 9 zone, these are the properties that are going to have all the needs and the majority of the wants. As I mentioned, there's almost always going to be just a little bit of compromise, and you just have to figure out what that's going to be. And then lastly, we have the 10 out of 10. I call it the purple unicorn because it pretty much never exists. Now, that's not to say you're never going to find this property. It's just extremely rare. And the people that do pursue this generally end up losing out because they realize that they really missed out on that 9 that they saw in the second week of viewing properties. And now prices are $50,000 higher. And on that note, I always have clients asking me, how many properties should we see? And the answer, well, it really depends. There really is no perfect number. You're almost always going to have that what if in the back of your mind. I've had people that bought the first property they walked into and absolutely loved it. And I've had others that have seen over 100 and never ended up buying. But once you've really got a handle on what it is you're looking for, you shouldn't be going out and viewing 5 properties every weekend. But on average, from collecting my own data, from polling others, as well as looking at some actual research, it seems like the sweet spot is somewhere between 8 to 12 properties. Moving on to part number 5, we are on to the offer process. So there are several components to an offer, but I just want to focus on the big 5 for now. These are the price, the deposit, closing date, offer expiry time, and subjects and conditions. So let's go through each of these in a little more detail. So of course, the price, pretty straightforward. This is going to be one of the major driving factors for the decision that the seller is going to make but it's definitely not the be-all end-all. And on that note, I want to mention that there are a couple of different ways that a seller will price their property. Way number one, they overprice it and hope to negotiate down. Or potentially they're just stubborn and they won't sell until they get their price. Way number two, they list at market value or very close to. And way number three is they underprice the property, and generally this is paired with an offer date. So what I mean by this is paired with the 3 listing strategies, there are also 2 offer presentation styles. Number 1 is taking offers at any time, and number 2 is setting a specific date and time. Previously, when the listing realtor set an offer presentation date and time, buyers were still able to write what we call a bully offer. So essentially what would happen is everyone else would be waiting until that specified date and time. Someone would come in with an offer prior to. The seller who had originally signed off on a direction regarding presentation of offers, or DRPO, would have to change the original one to the new time and date. And technically, the listing realtor was supposed to notify anybody who showed interest in the property and give them a reasonable amount of time to submit an offer. But this reasonable amount of time was pretty much gray area, and sometimes they would only give an hour or 2. And if people are at work or busy or in a meeting, you're out of luck. So recently they introduced the irrevocable direction regarding presentation of offers. So essentially, bully offers are no more. And if the seller sets a date and time, that is it, no negotiation around it. And essentially the thought process behind this was to create a level playing field for all the buyers. So moving on from that, it's going to be important to know how each property is dealing with offers. The reason being is if they're taking offers whenever, you want to show some urgency and get in there as soon as possible. Now, I'm not saying you have to drop everything and get in there within a few hours, which typically doesn't always work out anyways, as you have to give some sort of a heads up. But what I do mean is just trying to get in maybe on a Wednesday or Thursday rather than waiting till the Saturday or Sunday open house. Conversely, if there is an offer date, you have a little bit more time. You don't necessarily have to rush, but you are likely going to have to do more of your due diligence up front. Now, the reason for this is if there's an offer date, they're likely expecting to receive more than one offer. So you want to come in with the strongest offer possible. For instance, if it's a strata property, you want to read through all the strata documents. You want to have your property disclosure statement read and signed. You want to have your title reviewed and signed, because the less subjects on your contract, the stronger the offer will be. This could also potentially mean getting a pre-inspection. Now, ideally, we don't want to have to do this. However, if it is an extremely busy market and you really want the property, sometimes you're probably going to have to. But that's a conversation you should be having with your agent prior to. Now, getting back on track, our second aspect was the deposit. As previously mentioned, typically it's going to be around 5%. However, sometimes you can actually beef this up a little bit to strengthen your offer. And so this is going to be due at the end of subject removal, typically on the same day or within 24 hours. And it's not until you actually submit that deposit that the deal is final and firm. Next is going to be your closing dates. So here in BC, typically we're going to have our completion date, let's say on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and then often the possession date and adjustments date on a Friday or Saturday. Now, I've worked with clients in the past from places like Alberta, and they think this is absolutely crazy. And I do understand where they're coming from, because realistically, their money has already transferred into the seller's bank account, and even though their name is now on title, the seller's still living in the home for a couple more days. But one of the primary reasons for doing this is so that you don't get hit with any sort of additional fees for things like a bridge loan. Now, if it's a vacant property, they can typically be done one day after another, or even potentially on the same date. But ask almost any conveyancer and they're definitely not going to like it, because typically if the seller is trying to line up a purchase of their own, they're going to want to get the funds for the sale of their house, and then the following day or two, they're going to have to use those funds in order to purchase the next house. And oftentimes that can be a chain of events. And by leaving a couple of days in between, this ensures that things can go smoothly. And on that note, this is why dates are also extremely important to a seller. The reason being is if they do already have a purchase lined up, so if they've purchased before they've sold, those days are going to be super important. Nobody wants to move twice for number one, the headache, and number two, the cost. So as I mentioned, sometimes things of this nature can actually help you out even if somebody else has a slightly higher priced offer. Next is the offer expiry time. So in general, if you were to write an offer at noon or just afterwards, you would expect to probably hear back from the sellers by that evening. Now, generally your realtor is going to have a conversation with them to see their availability. Are they in town? Are they in a different time zone? But if they're selling and they're expecting offers, typically we can expect an answer within the same day. Now, when I talk to people from smaller towns, they think this is absolutely crazy because they may often have an offer that goes out that doesn't need a response for 48 or 72 hours. But typically here, we're trying to find the balance between not rushing the seller too much, but also not letting them have a massive opportunity to go back out and try to get a better offer. So it's definitely a little bit of a game. And then finally, we have our subjects and conditions. So the most common subjects you're going to see on most contracts are number one, financing. So making sure you can actually get a mortgage on the home, that it's going to appraise properly, and that there's nothing in the strata documents potentially that the lender doesn't like. Next is going to be a home inspection. So essentially in a home inspection, the home inspector is looking for anything that could substantially change the value of the property. So these could be things such as a major leak in the roof, anything of major health concerns, for instance, black mold in the attic, or something major like a crack in the foundation. What they're not there to do is nitpick the aesthetic aspects of the home, whether that's nicks and scratches on the floor or the walls needing to be repainted. Generally, they're looking for things that aren't necessarily apparent to the naked eye. Next, you're going to have subject to reviewing title. So essentially, you're looking for any charges, liens, or anything of that nature that may impact the property because you need to get the title free and clear. This is typically pretty easy to review. However, you are able to have it reviewed by a lawyer if you'd like. The most common thing you'll see on there is the seller's mortgage. But if it's a strata property, you may see a lot of other things. However, if you look at the actual date, typically it's prior to the unit actually being built. And in general, this doesn't actually impact your unit. Next is the property disclosure statement. And essentially what this is the seller disclosing everything that they are aware of in that property. This is a fairly lengthy document that asks several questions that the owner needs to disclose to the best of their abilities. Now, something to keep in mind is that if it was a vacant or tenanted property, that the owner will just cross it out. And this is common practice, so if you see this, don't freak out. Next is the subject to obtaining home or condo insurance. So you're going to want to make sure that the unit or home is actually insurable and at a reasonable rate. So during your subject removal period, this is when you're going to want to get in touch with an insurance company or broker to make sure that it's viable and of course is available at a reasonable cost. This generally isn't too much of an issue unless it's an extremely old building with things the insurer doesn't like to see, or they've had major claims in the past. So for instance, I know one of the things they often ask about is the age of the hot water tank. And if it's past 12 years old, they often make you replace it. Additionally, if the home is in a floodplain or places like the interior where there's often forest fires, sometimes there can be an extra premium or potentially even be uninsurable. Now, there are dozens of other subjects and conditions that can be added to your contract, but it's really going to depend on the unique property that you're looking at. So we'll just keep it at this for now. But there are other things you're probably going to want to put into your contract, such as ensuring that the property is left in clean condition with no garbage when you take possession. Additionally, it's always a good idea to allow yourself to have a couple of visits in the future prior to possession in case you're wanting to do things like renovations. And then lastly, I just want to mention the buyer's right of rescission, or potentially more commonly known as the cooling off period. So essentially, this is a 3-day cooling off period that starts after the date that your offer is accepted. Now, this was just brought in recently, and the reason being was to try and reduce buyer's remorse. Because in the heat of the market in 2021 and early 2022, people were writing subject-free offers and then regretting it the following day. So they chose to implement this ridiculous rule even after being consulted by realtors, stating that it wasn't a good idea. And realistically, all it's done is cause trouble. And in my opinion, probably actually push prices higher than if it wasn't there. But all you really need to know is that if you have subjects in your contract, it doesn't affect you. The only time it really does is if you're writing a subject-free offer. So another aspect of the contract is the inclusions and exclusions. Essentially, what is staying and what is going. So in general, all the appliances stay, meaning the washer, dryer, fridge, stove, and dishwasher. I also generally write in the microwave, and about 50% of the time, the listing agent crosses it out. But it never hurts to try. On top of this, all blinds and window coverings, and if there was anything else inside the house that you did want to keep, you can write it in here. But what I did cover is pretty standard. As far as exclusions, sometimes the seller will specifically ask you to add something into this section, or conversely, you want to ensure that something is removed from the property. For instance, if they've disclosed that the dryer doesn't work and you're going to be buying your own and replacing it, you want to make sure that they remove it and you aren't left responsible. But as you can see, there is a variety of ways that this can go. And generally the easiest way to determine if something is staying or going is whether or not it is a fixture or a chattel. Essentially, if it's a fixture, it is fixed to the property, whereas a chattel would be something like a couch. But at the end of the day, if it's something you're unsure of and you don't want there to be any confusion, make sure you write it into the contract. Moving on to the actual offer presentation time, there's a few things you're going to want to keep in mind. This is where having an experienced, detail-oriented, and creative agent is going to help you. So if you're writing an offer significantly below the asking price because you feel that they're priced too high, you're going to want to provide data to back it up. Generally, this is going to be recently sold comparable properties. And of course, the more recently sold they were and the more comparable they were, for instance, in a strata property, if it's from the exact same building, that's going to strengthen your argument. Additionally, it's always a great idea to attach a letter or a story or a video to your offer to talk a little bit about the offer itself as well as who is behind it. For instance, if you're a young family, attach a picture, talk about your family, say why it's such a perfect home, and really tug on the heartstrings of the seller. Most people have some level of emotional attachment, especially if it was their family home. And if at the end of the day they have two offers that are very similar, and there's your family who plans to actually live there and enjoy the space versus the developer who's just going to come in and knock it down, they're more than likely going to choose you. Additionally, if you're able to do your due diligence up front, which I briefly mentioned before, so reading strata documents, going through the property disclosure statement, reviewing the title search, and signing off on all these prior to, it can again strengthen your offer. One thing I often like to do for my clients, depending on the situation, is actually film a video of myself going over the offer, giving a bit of a backstory on them, and often going over how we came up with our number. So not only are they seeing who's on the other side of it, I'm actually able to convey a message to them, which in my opinion is actually stronger than a letter. Additionally, rather than just sending them comparable properties or spreadsheets, I can actually go over them in detail to show them how I came up with my numbers. And if there's any other message that I want to get across, for instance, maybe we're flexible with our dates and we can change those, then I can also add that in. And on more than one occasion, I've had the listing realtor reach out and tell me that the reason my clients got the property was because of my video, because it set us apart from the other offers, and it just humanized the whole process. Now, of course, it doesn't work every time, but I always do everything in my power to give my clients a leg up. Now, once you've submitted your offer, the seller has three options. Option number one, they just accept your offer right off the bat. Now, this doesn't happen very often, but you never know. Option number two, they just reject your offer and they don't send a counter. In general, this would only happen if potentially they got a better offer than yours or they felt like you were just too low. And option number three, which is typically the most common, is that they will send you a counter offer. So essentially, they will make changes to your original offer by crossing them out, putting the new values in, and then initialing off before sending it off to you. This is generally things such as the price, the subjects and conditions, or the dates. Once the seller has sent a counter offer to you, now you have the same three options as they did. You can accept it, you can decline it, or you can counter back again. Something to note here that I don't hear enough people talking about is the fact that just because that offer is open till, let's say, 8 p.m., the seller, or even yourself if it was going the opposite direction, can actually rescind that offer if it hasn't been responded to prior to doing so. Now, this has to be done in a very specific way and be in writing, and it doesn't happen that often. I've only had to a very few select times in my career, but it's always caught the other agent off guard. So when they say time is of the essence, it really is. Just because you have an offer that is open until a specific time in your hands doesn't mean it's going to be that way forever. They do have the ability to take it back, so just keep it in mind. And moving on to our sixth and final part, it is an accepted offer. Congratulations, but what's next? Well, now you've entered the subject removal period, given that it wasn't a subject-free offer. Then you'd be in the 3-day rescission period, but let's not go there. So during this time, you're going to want to work to fulfill your subjects. First of all, you're going to want to submit all the required documents to your mortgage broker or bank. They'll also likely request certain documents from your realtor as well, which I always have on file and send off right away. Next, you're going to want to book a home inspection if in fact you're going to get one, and this is something I always suggest, but a little tip here is to try and book it closer to the end of subject removal, just in case for some reason something else comes up in the meantime. Because the worst thing in the world is to pay for a home inspection only to have financing fall through when in fact you could have waited until you heard back. Additionally, you're going to want to review the documents, whether that be the property disclosure statement, the title search, and or the strata documents depending on the property type. Once you've done your due diligence and got the okay from your mortgage broker, your realtor, and anybody else involved in the process, now you can remove subjects. So there will be a subject removal document, which essentially is a copy and paste of the subjects that were in the contract, which you'll have to sign off on. And it's at this point in time that you're then going to submit your deposit, which is often done by way of bank draft. And this is either due on the day of subject removal or within 24 hours, depending what the contract says. You will give this to your realtor, who will then give it to their brokerage, who will hold it in a trust account. And the way you have to look at this money is essentially good faith money. And what I mean by that is if you're not able to carry out the purchase in the future for whatever reason, the examples I like to give my clients are for some reason you flee the country or you go bankrupt, then you should assume that the seller will get that as compensation. Now, it's not quite that simple and I'm not going to get into it, but just think of it that way. But if all goes well, that money will be released to the lawyer and then to the seller on completion date. So speaking of completion date, this is the day when the property's title is transferred from the seller to your name. It's also the day when the funds are transferred as well. Then at some point in the following couple of days, you're going to have both the possession date as well as the adjustments date, which will be on the same day. So adjustments, as previously mentioned, are going to account for the property taxes for the remainder of the year, as well as strata fees for the remainder of the month, depending if it's a strata property. And there could also potentially be other expenses. And then possession, this one's pretty straightforward. This is the day you actually get the keys and get to move in. So just a few things to note here in terms of the actual day that the deal goes firm and your completion date, which is often also referred to as closing. So a very quick turnaround, and the shortest you'd want to do is between 3 to 4 weeks. You really don't want to go short on this because A, you could incur rush fees, and B, you will really piss off both the lawyer and the mortgage broker. So as a rule of thumb, I would aim for at least 30 days minimum. However, if it is a vacant property and you don't have anything to sell, sometimes it can get done a little quicker. On average though, the normal range for closing would be between 8 to 12 weeks. And anything longer than 16 weeks is extremely long, and I do not advise it. And one of the reasons for this is typically your mortgage broker or lender is only able to hold your approval for up to 120 days. Once you start going beyond that, that's when you can potentially start running into issues, especially if there was any sort of major change in the market during that time or in your personal circumstances. Now, during this in-between period, there's a few things you're going to want to do. So first of all, you're going to want to contact and confirm dates with your lawyer or notary. Generally, they won't confirm anything with you until you've removed subjects, so it's one of the first things I like to do once you've done so. Next, if it's a strata property, you're going to want to contact the strata manager or the building manager in order to book the elevator, set up strata fees, and anything else. Next, you're going to want to set up your utilities, such as your hydro, your electricity, and your gas. And of course, this will be dependent on what your property has. But the most common thing that you may not have is gas if you're in a strata property that doesn't have either a gas stove or a gas fireplace. Next is going to be to change your mailing address. Additionally, you're probably going to want to set up mail forwarding so that any mail during that period of time that is sent to your previous address will get forwarded to your new one. And that should give you enough time to switch it over for anything that you haven't already. Now, as you actually approach your completion date, typically a few days prior, you're going to want to sign off with your lender as well as sign off with your lawyer. Something else to note is that you want to have your home or condo insurance set up starting on your completion date, not your possession date. The reason being is if something goes wrong between those two periods of time, there's a good chance you're going to be on the hook. And a quick note here is that as a seller, you actually want to make sure that your insurance doesn't stop until possession date. So typically there will be a few days of crossover, but you want to make sure you're protected. And then possession date. Congratulations, this is where we do the key handover. So this is typically arranged by your agent and the listing agent. Either it's a direct handoff, or they pick it up from the office or a lockbox or something of that nature. Then generally your agent will do a walkthrough with you to make sure everything is in order. I typically like to go in a little bit beforehand just in case there are any issues that I can try and deal with it before you get to the property. So for instance, the biggest one that I typically have to deal with is whether or not the property has actually been cleaned. In my contracts, I typically have that the seller must have the property professionally cleaned after moving out. But unfortunately, some people's definition of clean is a little bit different than mine. And realistically, even if they do have the property cleaned, you're probably going to want to clean it again, at least to some extent. But the biggest reason for this walkthrough is just to make sure that the home is in good condition and there's nothing substantial that needs to be dealt with. And at this point in time, if you haven't already, you're going to want to make sure that you set up your automated payments for Strata fees. Additionally, you should already have automated payments set up for your mortgage as well. And lastly, if it is a Strata property, you're going to want to make sure you have your entry code set up. For instance, if it's a gated community so you can get through the gate, and if it's a condo so that you can open the door from the comfort of your couch. And that's about going to wrap up today's video. So if you did get any sort of value whatsoever, all I ask is that you hit that thumbs up button so the algorithm will push it out to more individuals just like yourself who want to learn more about the buying process here in BC. If you are looking to purchase a property in Surrey, Langley, Vancouver, or the rest of the lower mainland for that matter, you can scroll down to book a call with me at a time that works best for you. And if you're not looking to buy in my market, but you are looking to buy elsewhere in BC and you don't have a realtor yet, I'd be more than happy to connect you with a fantastic realtor in the area that you're looking. So just reach out and I'd be happy to do so. I will also leave a link down in the description where you can download a free copy of my Ultimate Homebuyers Guide. Thanks so much for watching. Before you head out, check out another video on our channel and we'll see you in the next one.